The Assad regime was completely dependent on the support of Iran and the support of Hezbollah, two actors that are legitimately anti-Israel. But the Assad regime was always sort of working around in the background to try and work with Israel at the same time.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How have you been this time?
Not bad. It's a beautiful snowy day here in New York City. Kind of crazy. Canada apparently is about to no longer have a prime minister.
Yeah, I seen that. That was just coming in today.
Yeah, I mean we're going to be talking about regime change in this episode, and it turns out there's a regime change closer to home.
Well, let's hope it's a lot more peaceful than poor old Syria.
Yeah, let's hope. Do you know anything about Justin Trudeau? I honestly don't.
I try to, but the problem is I feel like you only hear it through American narratives, so they kind of go, oh, he's a socialist, so he's terrible. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure he's probably center-right and a bit of a neocon.
Yeah. I remember it was crazy to see. He's been there for like 10 years. Most of my sense of who Justin Trudeau is that he's hot. That is the main.
Well, he is Fidel Castro's son, isn't he?
Yes, that's that's what you hear. That's what you hear. So yeah, I guess that runs in the family, I guess. But I guess it's a testament to Canada that I don't know anything about Canadian politics.
Well, that's usually what you want. Remember, I think is it Jeremy Clarkson talked about how you sort of want to live in a boring country where nothing happens, and you go to exciting countries where things may all terribly go wrong. So yeah.
And my sense is that the Canadians aren't particularly happy, and after a decade, it's time for Justin Trudeau to go. And the incredible thing is, he's left.
Yeah.
That's really, is in the United States context, that never happens. We've got.
Well, I think, was it 4 years ago to the day? A lot of Americans got very grumpy and attacked the Senate.
They did. And, it didn't seem to have much of an impact. Just the idea that a politician would be as unpopular as Justin Trudeau or, say, Joe Biden was, and choose not to continue. It's just, it's something we could learn from Canada. We would not be in this Trump situation if Joe Biden had learned a similar lesson.
But do you think he should hold on regardless of how many lives it costs and then end up in Moscow?
Yeah, that would be one choice. That would be the Assad approach, which is not, in fact, what Justin Trudeau has done.
No, he's done something a bit more boring, which we commend on this podcast.
Indeed. It's good when people leave power voluntarily. It'd be nice if it happened in places like the United States and Syria as well. So that is what we're talking about today, is the country of Syria. It's been about a month now since the stunning fall of the Assad regime, a regime that had ruled, I see some people say 53 years, some people say 54 years. I haven't done the math myself. Father and son, yes. Hafez Assad and Bashar Assad. I think the general consensus is that Hafez Assad, who ruled from the 1970s until about the turn of the century, was a sort of titanically calculating, brutal Machiavellian figure who really ran Syria and, to some extent, the region with great cleverness. Was I think it was Josh Landis, who's a Syria expert in the United States, who said that he was expert in playing a bad hand well. His son seems to have been a bit of a doofus and managed to turn victory in the Syrian civil war into defeat.
Was he like third in line or something? I thought he was like supposed to be a doctor and he was in another country, and then it was like, nope, you're in charge now.
He's at least second. I think at least second in line.
The spare.
Yes, he is the spare. I believe his older brother was groomed to take power, and then I'm not sure if I recall this correctly, but I think his older brother might have died in a car crash rather stupidly or something along those lines. Regardless, he was not supposed to end up. And there were great hopes when he initially took over in 2000 or thereabouts. He was educated in London. He spoke mostly fluent English. He had the attractive young modern wife. Everybody was very excited. Certainly, it became clear that he didn't have the capacity to actually bring about the reforms or changes that were promised in Syria. But also, it's worth pointing out that he didn't really have a chance. There were
Yeah.
a number of really awful developments that sort of would have challenged his much more accomplishedly evil father, Hafez
Hmm.
Assad, that came roaring in on Bashar pretty much from, when he got there. I think he took over in 2000, and then you had 9/11 in 2001. You had the United States crushing Iraq in 2003. I think he tried to play a bad hand well and failed. There's some reasons to believe that he supported the insurgency against the United States to some extent. But at the same time, he was also working with the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies to do all kinds of shady renditions and torture people to get information that the United States wanted. And he was
He would have
always,
still been working with Russia at the time, wouldn't he?
well, he was working with everybody. I mean, and I think Assad had this. We talked about how in a recent episode on Lebanon, we talked about how his father, Hafez Assad, despite being a staunch enemy of Israel, uh, closely aligned with the Soviet Union, took over Lebanon in 1990 with the pretty much the acquiescence of the United States because it was a resolution to the nasty Lebanese civil war. So, there was always just sort of a back and forth and a strangeness and I was just thinking, I don't know that this is the case, but perhaps Assad's status as a religious minority on top of the Syrian government made it harder for him to make peace with Israel the way that Abdullah and Anwar Sadat in Egypt, who actually got shot for doing that, did. I mean, who's to say? This is a long time gone, and
Yeah.
and it's an era that is, and I think that is just worth pointing to. This is something that has been the Assad regime has been a fact of the region for, let's see, 50 years. Yeah, I suppose that would be the majority of the time since Syria's independence
Hmm.
in the mid 1940s. So yeah,
Yeah.
if you're talking about the whole era since the independence of the region in the 1940s, the Assad regime has been a big factor for all of it, and now it's
Hmm.
gone. So we are sitting down to do a Syria episode a month after the fall of the Assad regime, in the idea that the dust has settled, but as I think it will become clear, the dust has nowhere near settled. The dust will be settling from this for years to come. It is a massive, massive change to the region, and I think we'll start teasing that out a little bit in this episode, talking about specifically what the Trump administration might do, because as is always the case in the Middle East
Yes.
and most of the world, it's what the United States does that matters absolutely the most here, despite this multipolar world we keep hearing about.
Are you surprised that the peace has somewhat held up until now?
I'm impressed. I'm flatly impressed with the gentleman that we are, I suppose, being discouraged to continue calling Al Jolani. That is his
Mm.
nom de guerre. He is now being. I actually wrote this down because I
Is
have
it
to.
Frank Thompson?
Yes, it's Jeff. Jeff Miller. No,
Yes.
his name is apparently his given name, and the name that he is now going under as Syria's de facto ruler is Ahmed al-Shara.
Al-Shara.
Probably we will use the names Jolani and Ahmed al-Shara interchangeably over the course of this podcast, but we will probably fall into the standard practice in the coming months and years of referring to him as Ahmed al-Shara rather than Jolani, as we've known him for a decade. But yeah, Jolani, his organization, HTS, has been shockingly competent at maintaining the peace. We saw one of the biggest blowups was a sort of wave of Alawite unrest a couple weeks back. Supposedly, a shrine had been destroyed during the early December period when HTS was taking over the country, but it was kept under wraps, and then it was revealed that an Alawite shrine had been destroyed, and there was massive Alawite unrest. Of course, the Alawite unrest would really only be important on the coast, which is sort of the Alawite stronghold
Hmm.
there. And supposedly, HTS acted quickly to mollify Alawite leaders. I don't know if they went so far as to apologize, but sort of made it clear that that was during the crisis of of us taking over. That's not the new policy. That's the people involved have been chastised to some degree. So supposedly that aspect was tamped down. But I mean, who's to say? It is, I think, a certain level of oppression, of retaliation, of revenge, frankly, is going to be happening, targeted at minority groups. The Assad regime was an Alawite regime and also collected other minority groups in Syria around it to be used as instruments of power, like the Christians. And some degree of targeting and revenge is inevitable. So I think that people who looking at every individual murder or bit of repression that takes place and using that as an excuse to say, they're definitely the same terrorists they always were. This is all illegitimate. I think that's really unfair. However, we should absolutely keep our eyes peeled for the developing trends and the developing approach of this HTS government that has, in the month we've seen so far, been very, very impressive in its lack of violent sectarianism, in the efforts that they have made. The fact that we should give them the benefit of the doubt around individual crimes does not mean that we should just sort of assume everything's going to be fine.
Yes. What way do you pronounce HTS? It's a wee bit tricky for me.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Yes, that's it. So yeah, they're the main force behind why this happened. They're not obviously the only rebel group in Syria, but they definitely seem like the one that kicked down the rotten door.
Well, what's interesting is that HTS is, and what's so frustrating for the United States is that HTS is the successor to al-Nusra, which is the successor to al-Qaeda. And HTS was very carefully seen as somehow different by the Obama administration.
Mhm.
Both the Obama and the Trump administrations continued to bomb HTS. I don't think there's been much of that during the Biden administration because by 2020, HTS and the enclave of Idlib were almost entirely under Turkish control and protection. I know there were bombings in HTS territory because every new leader of the Islamic State, I think including Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that has been killed by the United States, has been killed in HTS territory, which should give you a piece of information about just how separate these jihadi elements are. The Obama administration, to its credit, not so much the Trump administration.
Okay.
The Trump administration pretty much stopped funding jihadism in Syria, which was pretty much and when the United States stopped funding violent jihadism in Syria, that was pretty much the end of the Syrian civil war, which also tells you things. HTS was a strong element in the Syrian resistance from the point that it split from ISIS in 2013. But throughout the fight against ISIS, or at least the main part of the fight against ISIS, the U.S. government was continuing to bomb HTS and ISIS. Because it was the good moderate rebels who were jihadists, we'd acknowledge that, but they're against Assad, and they're very careful to say that they're not fighting with HTS and they're fighting against the Islamic State. I think it was more true that they were fighting against the Islamic State because the Islamic State was so jealous of and so wanted to be monolithic and its own thing. And if you didn't get on board entirely, they were going to kill you. But HTS was also supposed to be, no, you can't work with HTS because they're al-Qaeda. But of course, when the rebels had the biggest success that they ever had, which was taking Idlib city in the Idlib province, which is where HTS and Jolani came roaring out of at the end of November of this year to take over the whole country. When that happened in 2015, it was funded by the Obama administration and a lot of our allies. And we're like, no, but we didn't fund the HTS components. Though, of course, the HTS components, at that time, they probably would have still been al-Nusra. I haven't got the timeline exactly down. At that point, of course, the al-Nusra folks were doing the main fighting, were at the forefront of this battle that took Idlib. And that was been the case to the U.S. government's great chagrin all the time since 2015 when Idlib was taken. Jolani merged al-Nusra, became HTS as a merger between a whole bunch of other supposedly bigger, supposedly more moderate, supposedly more significant groups that have functionally disappeared. I think you can find RR al-Sham used to be the biggest group. I think there are some RR al-Sham figures at the top of the Syrian Salvation Government, which is the another rebranding of HTS essentially. But generally speaking, like Jelani, now Ahmed al-Shara, was always on top and would just absorb these groups and absorb these groups. And really the whole point, I'm beginning to realize the whole point of there being other groups that were supposedly so moderate and supposedly so different, even though we always knew they were jihadists, was mostly to take US money and have this structure that could fight against Assad and supposedly be separate from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And I mean, it was always kind of a fiction.
So do you think a lot of these smaller groups were a fiction?
I like, were there actual smaller groups with smaller leaders? Absolutely. Did some of them fight against, all of them, including HTS, fought against the Islamic State when, they weren't hiding Islamic State leaders? There were absolutely smaller little warlords who, as in, Afghanistan, we should definitely, I think, be leery of comparing the Afghanistan and Syria situations, as we may a little bit today. These are very different societies, as Ahmed al-Shara keeps emphasizing. But yeah, I mean, there were definitely little groups and little warlords. I mean, if the United States says we want to give a bunch of money and weapons to a group, somebody's going to set up that group. Like it existed, it had an existence. And amusingly, these groups would have, because the amount of money they had, like I remember specifically like grabbing a drink with like this very attractive British woman who was the media arm of one of these groups. Like it
Wow.
was just such a strange world around this war. And I guess we should say, like, and this war was functionally over by 2016, 2017, when Russia started to double down, I
Yeah.
believe at the end of 2015. And then when Trump came to office and was like, hey, we should stop funding jihadists. It's also just really bad and they suck. And really, as soon as he did that, not only did the Civil War end, the Islamic State also dried up. So there were always, absolutely the Islamic State fought against HTS and real people died and were killed. But at the same time, there were also funding
So
relationships and
weirdly,
arms
Russia and
relationships.
America worked together to bring peace.
Yeah. And then, of course, the United States acted to make sure that peace never came. In 2017, it was sort of functionally done here. There was a big spike in fight. And what we sort of saw was Russia, and with the Islamic State being crushed, Russia and Turkey sponsored elements sort of came up against each other. And in 2020, in a spike of violence, the Russian supported groups and the Turkish supported groups ended up clashing directly, which led to some dead Turkish soldiers and I think a few dead Russian soldiers. And that was a big deal in 2020. And after 2020, it was essentially completely solidified. Importantly, there were all these chunks in Syria that like the Damascus suburbs, like I think places around Homs, what have you, that were controlled by rebel groups. All of those rebel groups, as part of the deals to end the civil war, the fighters could get on a bus and go to Idlib, which ends up looking like a bad move by Russia and the Syrians. So those fighters went to Idlib with the hopes that, oh, there's just this terrible, they're really just going to end up fighting against each other because that's all these groups really, really do.
Yeah.
But it turns out like maybe that was kind of more of a fiction, not a fiction, like a real thing that was developed by all the disparate funding sources from the US and the Allies. And when it all sort of dried up and it was mostly just still USAID feeding everybody in Idlib, but for the armed support, it was really just Turkey. It turns out that Idlib was able to consolidate and not become, and to be clear, there were battles within Idlib. There were, but there was a winner. And there was always the same winner, which was Jelani, now Ahmed al-Shara of HTS. So 2020 is the point at which, and this is kind of key if we're talking about Turkish relations, up until between 2015 and 2020, the Turks kept HTS at sort of arm's length. There's the Syrian National Army elements up north, which are mostly gangs of thugs for genociding Kurds. But then Idlib was sort of somewhat separate and different. But after 2020, when this conflict spiked between the Syrian army and Turkey, sponsored by Russia and Turkey. Turkey pretty much straightforwardly garrisoned. The end result of that in 2020 was Turkey pretty much protecting Idlib. And it is that Turkish-sponsored pocket from 2020, arguably earlier, to 2024 that has now taken over all of Syria.
Well, because Turkey is a very intimidating army. It's right on their border, and this is something that really concerns Turkey, especially the Kurdish element.
Yeah, and I think it's important. One of the most outrageous things that I've been very outraged about over the past month is the way that Israel has treated this new Syrian government. It is outrageous. It is worth calling out. Essentially, the Assad regime fell, and we've been learning actually that the Assad regime, nominally so antagonistic to Israel, was actually collaborating with Israel on a number of levels in some interesting ways. The Assad regime was completely dependent on the support of Iran and the support of Hezbollah, two actors that are legitimately anti-Israel, but the Assad regime was always sort of working around in the background to try and work with Israel at the same time. The key point I wanted to make is, like, as angry as I am at Israel, I think there's a real blind spot because of my own affection for Turkey. I lived in Turkey for 6 years. I really think that the United States is unfair to Turkey, essentially got Turkey to sponsor this civil war and then sort of backed out and started complaining about Turkey's sponsorship of this war. Turkey has invaded and occupied significant chunks of Syria. Yeah, Israel's been there since 1967 in the Golan Heights, but that was at least the result of like a state-on-state war.
Yeah.
Turkey started a civil war in Syria with the full direction, guidance, and funding of the United States, and then used that to occupy Syrian territory and is pursuing one of the most straightforward genocidal campaigns of this century in Syria. And I think that Turkey has essentially won a huge victory. HTS is like its client state. It now controls all of Syria. But I think that it was wrong of me to be so indignant, so justly indignant about what Israel did after the fall of the Assad regime. Basically took out Syria's navy, took out Syria's air defenses, took out Syria's air force. It was wrong of me to be so indignant about that while I'm kind of just like, smiling and nodding over Turkey's outright genocidal actions. To be specific, what Turkey had did in Afrin was basically is more or less, people who compare what Israel does to the Palestinians to what Turkey does to the Kurds more generally are largely full of it. But because Turks, the most likely successor to Erdogan comes from Kurdish descent, is like half Kurdish descent, Hakan Fidan.
Okay.
Like, Turkey is violently against Kurdish nationalism, and but if a given Kurdish person says, you know what, Turkey, you're right, I'm Turkish, then Turkey welcomes them with open arms. This is, needless to say, not the reaction of the Israeli state. No Palestinians have the avenue to be like, you know what? I'm an Israeli citizen. There are, to be sure, Israeli Arab citizens, but they are second-class citizens, and you don't get to volunteer to be that. So generally, it is unfair to compare Turkish treatment of the Kurds to Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. However, in Afrin specifically, this is sort of the western corner of Syria, sort of surrounded by Turkey on three sides. That was a traditional long-term Kurdish area of Syria, and as part of the encroachment of Turkey onto Syrian territory between 2016 and the present day, I think in 2019 specifically, Afrin was wiped out.
Is that when you had the big controversy with Trump not
That was certainly the one of, I think, multiple big controversies over Trump not adequately standing up for the Kurds or what have you.
Was Trump just completely sort of against doing anything in Syria, or?
Absolutely not. Trump made a big show of that and saying that he was going to withdraw and he didn't care. But actually, the formal long-term non-special forces engagement of U.S. troops in Syria happened under Trump. I think you could make a good case that Trump didn't want that to happen, like legitimately, honestly didn't want that to happen, but he was easily manipulated by the generals and by the U.S. national security state. So to take the oil, he's the guy who initially put in a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and then I believe it might be U.S. Army now that has like. So Trump actually brought about the permanent occupation of Syria by U.S. troops, but he did repeatedly say that he wanted to get out. And he did have repeated conversations with Erdogan where he's like, you know what, screw it, we're out of here, you take over. And he did allow Turkey to invade, and I think it is fair to use the term certainly ethnically cleanse, but I think genocide, specifically in Afrin, specifically a historically Kurdish territory where there are now no Kurds. That is genocide defined. I've heard numbers bandied about like 100,000 killed or something along those lines. I don't know. I can't speak to the veracity of those numbers. I think that could also make a case that most of those people were merely ethnically cleansed and they now live in Hasaka or Kobani or Qamishli. It was really just a brutal, nasty thing. And it's up there with what Israel's done to Palestine, what Azerbaijan did to Nagorno-Karabakh, and what the Burmese and the Burmese rebels have done to the Rohingya. I mean, it's like top 4 genocides. What the Ethiopians have done to Tigray, it's like top 5 genocides of the century. And I think we should, as we're congratulating Turkey on its essentially new client territory, client country of Syria, we should probably emphasize more that they did so, and they didn't even have to. They did sort of commit a genocide on the way.
Because I think people quite forget how powerful Turkey is. Like, I think Russia is genuinely scared of Turkey. I was just wanting to change the subject ever so slightly. With what you've just said, do you think you'd be allowed back in Turkey? Like, if Turkish officials listen to this episode?
I don't think I am of notice to anybody in Turkish officialdom. And I think I'm generally on record as being pretty pro-Turkish on a lot of levels. That, like, I think a snippet, if anybody were aware of what I was saying, a snippet on one podcast episode is probably not going to make much of a difference.
So it's definitely nowhere near a police state or anything like that.
Oh, sure it is, but I'm just not important. I'm just not important enough. I am A, not important enough, and B, as a, comfortably off white guy with a law degree with connections in the Turkish legal field and connections to Turkish wealthy people, I am not worth bothering with.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I just thought maybe they might, like, say you try to fly there for a holiday, you might be denied or something like that.
Oh, if I were a Turkish national, or if I were a journalist with a bigger platform working for a more recognized institution, I think saying what I said just right there would be grounds for, but I'm not going to run like a series of videos on the Turkish genocide or whatever. It's just like, it's, maybe I should. I'm now embarking on a more serious reckoning with the genocide I've been supporting in Gaza, but I'm not directly subsidizing what Turkey is doing in Syria. I am directly subsidizing what the Israel and the U.S. government are doing in Gaza. But I do think I was unfair to Israel to be so
one-sided or blindsided,
legitimately incensed by what they did to this new Syrian government after the fall of the Assad regime, but then to not talk about what Turkey has done here. I mean, like, what Turkey has done here is directly analogous to what Russia has done to Ukraine, to what the United States did to Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and Somalia, and did I mention Libya? It is, and what Saudi Arabia's done to Yemen, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, it's an invasion of their neighbor. It appears to have been riotously successful. It'll be very interesting to see how, if he survives, to see how Ahmed al-Shara deals with the presence of Turkish troops. So after 2020, and this is the key point here, like, the only reason there was still HTS or the Syrian National Army or any rebel-occupied territory, especially after 2020, the only reason there was still rebel-occupied territory, distinct from the Kurdish-occupied territory, the only reason there was still rebel-occupied territory was because of the direct military protection of that territory by Turkey and Turkish troops.
Okay.
So if you look up until the Wall Street Journal has a horribly wrong video that says that the Syrian rebels took Aleppo, which is bullshit. They never did. They took about a third of Aleppo, and that's what we were talking about with the fall of Aleppo. The fall of rebel Aleppo was they took a third of it. Like 2/3 of the city was always controlled by the Assad regime throughout the war. But that Wall Street Journal video actually is very interesting because it has a good map of Syria in October of 2024. And really, you had Assad regime controlling most everything that matters. The Kurdish chunk of Syria looking very, very impressive, but it's sort of mostly desert. And then at
What's
the very
that river
tip,
called? The Euphrates, is it?
well, there's the Tigris and the Euphrates, so sort of the two great rivers that go through.
So yeah, it almost looks
Syria.
like the Kurds have nearly half of the country, but as you say, a lot of that is just inhospitable desert.
Yes, and yeah, absolutely some really important agricultural land. Whenever I point to the
Especially
fact
along that river.
that the Kurds in the United States had taken away the oil, someone in the comments says, and also our important agricultural land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But in 2024, up until the end of November of 2024, the only territory that wasn't the government or Kurdish across the Turkish border you had parts that are just explicitly Turkish government held. Then you had parts in between them that are held by the Syrian National Army, which are really just the nasty militias that Turkey maintains of Syrians for the purpose of genociding Kurds. And then you had the pocket of Idlib. But that whole little rim there, from the HTS-controlled areas to the Syrian National Army-controlled areas, all of that was garrisoned not just by Turkish air forces, but by Turkish troops on the ground.
Wow.
Like they had outposts there. Like, I mean, and yes, there are explicitly held territories by the Turkish government. And the specific, the genocide of Afrin that I was talking about was that it's sort of like the top of Syria. That was Afrin, that was a Kurdish region that Turkey just sort of invaded and crushed and pushed everybody out into the other Kurdish regions. If Ahmed al-Shara had only taken Aleppo, then there really wouldn't be any reason talking about HTS or Ahmed al-Shara as like a powerful, independent entity. Like it would really have just been exclusively, as I said in a short at the time, Turkish imperialism. It just part of the Turkish government, really. Just a mild expansion of the Turkish-controlled territory of Syria. Because HTS was so incredibly successful, and I do not, despite the fact that it's heavily supported by Turkey and all the people in Idlib were fed by the United States throughout this period, I don't want to take away from HTS's accomplishment because it is extraordinary. They didn't just take Aleppo, they took the whole damn country. And because they took the whole damn country, HTS and Ahmed al-Shara has a little more wiggle room with Turkey. It's not automatically just like a section of Turkey now.
Yeah,
like
Ottoman Empire 2.0.
Yeah, it's not just that. That's potential, and there's certainly Ahmed al-Shara, the way that he's treating Hakan Fidan, who is now the foreign minister. He was a longtime intelligence chief for Erdogan, seen as probably the most likely successor to Erdogan in the AK party, and unfortunately probably Turkish government. Hakan Fidan, Ahmed al-Shara is meeting with anybody he can. I think the Germans and the French kind of embarrassed themselves last week. The German foreign minister showed up in sweatpants, apparently.
Oh.
So he's meeting with anybody he can, and he's putting on suits and he's putting on ties. But with Hakan Fidan, the Turkish guy, they had a relaxing evening at a tea garden overlooking Damascus, like sitting there amiably and clearly sitting there in a joint triumph that they had brought about. So by taking the whole country, Ahmed al-Shara can now be seen as more of an ally of Turkey rather than just a straight up, employee. But it's like Syria is significantly less independent from Turkey than, say, the United Kingdom is from the United States, which is a pretty low position of subservience, frankly. So like Syria is even less independent of Turkey than the United Kingdom is from the United States, or occupied Germany is from
Oh,
the
okay.
United States.
Wow.
So so yeah, I mean it's like, but it is not just a complete subjugation to Turkey. It might end up being that. I mean, we'll see. We'll
How
see.
bad is this for the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which tend to be sort of Kurdish focused?
Terrible.
Mm.
Absolutely terrible. That is probably, yeah. So SDF, it is probably reductive to say the SDF are just the Kurds. The whole point of the Syrian Democratic Forces is that with a lot of U.S. funding, this was the infrastructure of, yes, legitimate other Arab fighters built up around the Kurds, but led by the
Because it
Kurds.
seems to be a lot of different ethnic groups that are also minorities.
I mean, I think it's mostly just, I'm sure there are, because there are a lot of minorities across that population, but the key thing for the Kurds was to have some Sunni Arab tribal affiliates. Among many other problems for the SDF and the Kurds is that now that Assad has been defeated, those generally Sunni Arab tribal elements are like, why are we working with you anymore? The Islamic State, which we did not like, is gone. The Assad regime, which we hated, is gone. We'd like to just rejoin Syria. Thank you very much. And we saw that when the regime vacated Deir ez-Zor, which is probably the most important, that was definitely the most important eastern city in Syria. The Kurds quickly took it over. The SDF quickly took it over, like, oh, look at us. We're great. And then 3 days later, the Syrian government had chased them out, essentially. And I think that's a really weird dynamic, is the traditional home of Kurds in Syria is Afrin up in the northwest, which has been completely wiped out, and then sort of Hasaka and Kamishli up in that sort of little northeastern sort of tail of Syria. But they were able to take a lot more territory down to Deir ez-Zor and I think the Tigris and Euphrates, or at least one of those rivers, enabled by U.S. money and by the fact that the Arabs who actually live there didn't like the Islamic State or the Assad government. The Islamic State and the Assad government are functionally gone. A lot of the SDF territory just wants to go back and be part of Syria. Another real problem for the SDF is the SDF always kind of knew that if the United States pulled out, they could go work with the Assad government because the Assad government needs competent fighters. The SDF had competent fighters. They had actually worked together pretty closely up until 2014 or even 2015. The Kurds are sometimes classified as rebels against Assad, but that's never actually how it worked. The Assad regime would, have to vacate an area and they would hand over important facilities to the Kurds as caretakers because they knew the Kurds were a very different thing from the Syrian rebels that were fighting
Is
against the
that why you
Assad
didn't really
regime.
see the Kurds expand their territory in this falling of Assad?
Well, they did, as I
Okay.
said, with Deir ez-Zor.
Oh,
They,
sorry.
they they expanded into it and then realized that what they were expanding with a tool that was like kind of built on sand and was disintegrating. So with the Assad regime falling apart, I mean, that's what they would always do if the Assad regime pulled back. Even initially in 2012, 2013, the Kurds would sort of take over. And then especially when we saw this directly in 2019 when Turkey was invading and wiped out Afrin, the Syrian government then stepped up because it was entirely in the Syrian government's benefit to say, no, because the Turkish government, at least officially, just doesn't want the Kurds in control. For a long time, they didn't care who controlled the border, whether it was the Syrian government or the Syrian rebels, as long as it wasn't the Kurds. So one of the rounds of Turkish attempts to wipe out the Kurds was stopped by the Assad regime, and I think to some extent cooperating, like the Syrians, the Russians, the Americans cooperating together to police the Syrian border
Hmm.
with Turkey, which is kind of nuts. But that was sort of the arrangement that existed. That arrangement is gone. The Syrian military forces that were the Assad regime forces that were a minor, like, semi-buffer between the Turkish-controlled areas and the Kurdish-controlled areas are gone. The potential of eventually, when America leaves, allying much more explicitly with the Assad regime, that's gone. The Kurds are now completely surrounded by more or less, well, honestly, by a couple political entities that are only unified by their hatred of the Kurds. Now, there's the SNA, which is the Turkish-sponsored Syrian rebel thugs, and there's the HTS, and it's not entirely clear to me what the relationship between the SNA and HTS is at this point. Probably HTS doesn't really like the SNA and would probably like to absorb it and take its territory, but they can agree with the SNA on wanting to take the much larger Kurdish territory that controls the oil, that controls the that agricultural territory. So the Kurds are a bigger problem for Ahmed al-Shara right now than the Kurds and than the Turks and the Turks thugs are. It'll be interesting to see that if they do successfully come to some kind of arrangement with the Kurds, hopefully one that doesn't lead to them being completely wiped out, then would Ahmed al-Shara have a falling out with the SNA. It probably won't be during Ahmed al-Shara's lifetime that he'll have a falling out with Turkey. That's how much he owes to Turkey. But it will be interesting to see if the Kurds are defeated. Then I wouldn't be very surprised to see the SNA be completely absorbed into the Syrian government or what have you.
Can you see this an area where everyone's just waiting for Trump to get in?
That is a very perceptive array. That is exactly what we're looking at right now. Because we are the most, so this will be uploaded. We're recording this a week before this will be uploaded. So keep in mind, many things could have happened.
Yes.
But I still think this is a worthwhile survey regardless, even if it's far in the past. It'll be a full fifth or sixth of the life of the new Syrian government will have elapsed between recording this and uploading this. So, the Syrian government is on week 5.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be on week 6 by the time this is uploaded. But the biggest news today, Monday, January 6th, is that the United States, the outgoing Biden administration, has delivered some incredibly weak sauce in terms of sanctions relief, and essentially said, there was a very key thing that was done earlier on. Ahmed al-Shara, with his just a step removed, this is a guy who was in ISIS, was in al-Qaeda, but has disavowed both. He disavowed ISIS in 2013, he disavowed al-Qaeda in 2016, had a $10 million U.S. bounty on his head. That, I think a week or two after this guy became essentially the head of state of Syria, the United States was like, we are no longer enforcing that bounty, and it was taken off the website. So,
that's nice.
Woohoo! That's a good step. And as a really, really weak step, the Biden administration today announced that none of the sanctions are being lifted, but they are allowing a new set of licenses for humanitarian organizations. This is the same. You remember there was a horrific earthquake, 3 or 4 years ago? Or was it 2 years ago? I can't remember exactly when it was.
It was like 2 years ago.
For the 6-month period, the Biden administration was like, okay, we're going to let up on these country-killing sanctions a little bit to get humanitarian stuff in. That existed for 6 months, elapsed, and was done. So we're giving them a new 6-month exemption, which is honestly enraging.
So in a lot of ways, they're still treating them as if Assad's in charge?
Yes. Flatly. Mm-hmm. Some of this is cowardice, and it's the real problem with sanctions as an instrument that we've seen over and over and over again. It's really easy if you lift a sanction. I mean, Obama will go to his grave hearing about how he gave the Iranians millions of billions of dollars, which was he essentially, as part of a really valuable, really beneficial to the United States, really exclusively Iranian disarmament deal. He lifted a few sanctions that allowed Iran to access some of its own funds. So sadly, that Obama lesson makes it really hard for any politician to ever lift a sanction. And this is the most ridiculous possible illustration of it. These sanctions were put in place to get rid of the Assad regime. The Assad regime is gone, and the truly horrific thing is that the sanctions were instantiated, I think they started in 2020, were passed in law in 2019, with a 5-year window. So they were actually renewed for their next 5-year window after Assad had fallen.
Oh my, that's horrific.
Which is pretty extraordinary. And unfortunately, Trump's record is not very good.
No.
Is specifically on this issue. The U.S. Maintained much lower level, to be clear, like much more. I mean, they were bad, but they were nowhere near as evil and country destroying as the Caesar sanctions we've maintained on Syria since 2020. I mean, essentially, after Assad won, we applied these sanctions that turned his victory to ashes. With Sudan, we had these sanctions in place, and the dictator that they were meant to be against fell in 2019, but Trump wouldn't lift the sanctions until Sudan signed a deal with Israel that everybody in Sudan hated, that contributed to the fall of the attempt at a democratic transition and ended it up with Sudan in a horrific, bloody civil war. And I would not be surprised at all if Trump were to do something similar
Yeah,
with Syria.
it's not surprising. Could you tell me more about like how organic is the Syrian Free Army? Because when you look at the bottom of the all the different parties involved, you'll
Mhm.
see this big like artificial circle of like a
Mhm.
US base, and it's like, oh,
Mhm.
we're here with the Syrian Free Army. I'm just like, what's going on there?
Do you mean the Free Syrian Army, the FSA?
No, well, there's the Syrian Free Army, not to be confused with the Free Syria, or the Syrian Free Army, not to be confused with the Free Syrian Army.
I honestly don't even know what you're talking about. But that
Yeah.
doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's a whole architecture
Mm-hmm.
of people that have been sitting in Geneva and Istanbul,
Yeah.
um, old regime figures who defected in 2012 and 2013, and they've been sitting around with high-priced lawyers. Uh, Another attractive American woman I knew was in Istanbul, had flown in for a couple of years to be the lawyer for one of these groups of very, very modern, very palatable to European and American sort of official government. There's generations of like official
Yeah.
governments in exile or whatever. I don't know anything about them because
Okay.
why know anything about them? I knew they were meaningless. And as we're seeing this month, they are completely meaningless. None of them are being invited back to help. I mean, maybe some of them will at some point, but they're not actually the government of Syria in any way.
Because it seems to be part of this Al Tanf US base that's on like the Jordan-Iraqi
Oh,
border.
okay. Al-Tanf is different. Al-Tanf is flat U.S. occupation.
Mm-hmm. So is that just a fake like rebel group that America kind of invented, or?
Again, like it's not a fake rebel group. If it's got a leader, it's got fighters,
Mm,
and it's got weapons.
yeah.
But does that particular entity exist because of the Al-Tanf U.S. military base? Absolutely. Like, oh no, I mean, maybe not. Who knows? Like, I can't speak to the actual organizational history of whatever that particular microgroup is because it's impossible to do so, or it's impossible to have that kind of granular knowledge and focus on absolutely anything else. So yeah, I mean, Al-Tanf is a special. That is another interesting dynamic. So if you look at that Wall Street Journal map that shows how it grew, there was, I think, the Free Syria. No, it's the Syrian Free Army.
The Syrian Free Army is the one in this US base, and there is a different one called the Free Syrian Army.
The Free Syrian Army is a long defunct umbrella group. That was supposedly who the rebels were before we all realized it was mostly just
Hmm.
Al Qaeda and ISIS. What was interesting and is kind of surprising that HTS has done such a good job of managing this is that as HTS came storming out of Idlib and came coming down the country, the U.S.-backed rebels around Al-Tanf, I think, took Palmyra and started coming in from the desert, and then much more serious groups from Quneitra in the south, though of course I think Quneitra is now being further occupied by Israel, like started coming up from the north and sort of converged on Damascus. And it does seem Ahmed al-Shara is doing a decent job of working with those groups, absorbing those groups. Don't know the details of those groups, specifically in the south, with the support of the Jordanians and to some
Israel?
debatable extent the Israelis. Those were much more serious groups that actually did something that very few other rebel groups were able to do. Was they made deals with the Assad regime that involved them keeping their weapons and staying where they were and just saying, okay, you're in charge now. So those are some serious groups, and I think it's a testament to Ahmed al-Shara's seriousness that he's managed to keep them on side. And supposedly, all of those groups, at least, are being absorbed into the Syrian military proper, but we'll see how that goes.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a traditional, very difficult thing. I think another issue that I want to bring up here, perhaps a- an issue of extraordinary complexity, but I think is really worth bringing up is, you know what Guantanamo is, right?
Yes, the part of Cuba that America uses because it's sort of outside its normal laws to sort of interrogate and torture people.
Yes. So as of this point, we have, I think there's something like 12 guys left in that weird, and what's so horrifying about it is that it's a complete legal black hole. Like these are people they're just people who now no longer exist. I think
Hmm.
some of them got some kind of plea bargain that was going to allow them to at least like move to a real jail for the rest of their lives or something along those lines. But even that, I think there was big
But how
pushback
long have
against
they
that.
been there? Because your mind would be mush. Like, are you there 20 years at this point?
There are multiple men who have been there for 20 years
Wow.
and with limited so that's horrible, and that's obviously terrible what we're doing to, well, what we're doing currently doing to these, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 men, and what we've done to dozens or maybe hundreds of men beforehand. We actually, at this point, currently, and now for 5 or 6 years, not quite a decade yet, but we maintain in Kurdish occupied territory in Syria, we maintain a camp very similar to that, except it's got 55,000 people in it.
55,000?
55,000 people in it, and lots of them are women and children.
Hmm.
So that's one of the I've always sort of been vaguely aware of this and just not wanted to look into it because it's so horrible.
Yeah, it's just miserable and
You
depressing.
might have heard about this in the European context. So this is where, you know how all the European countries don't want to take back their Islamic State guys?
Mm-hmm.
I think Australia is also refusing to take back. So these are people who have citizenships in European countries, Australia, Canada, even I think.
I think Belgium had a lot for some reason.
Yeah, that checks out. Who went to fight in Syria for ISIS, and the countries don't want them back. Those are particularly egregious examples. That's not all of the. I think I saw numbers. I don't know if these numbers are accurate. 10,000 fighters and then 55,000 total. I don't know if that's fighters or suspected fighters or women and children. There are a lot of women and children for sure. So you have people who have gone from being children to being young men and women in these camps, and there's no plan for them to go anywhere. The Kurds kind of have been complaining about this for most of a decade, but also, I think, want to hold on to these camps because they're another reason for the United States to interact with them.
It's a bit like when you hear about like weapons traffickers, them not doing anything about it, because sometimes it's useful for the CIA to have an airplane that's off the
Mhm.
radar, run by a dodgy boy. Like, it's
Yeah,
just good to have
yeah.
these places, Rob. You never know when you need them.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it's, if we're angry about the 10 guys in Guantanamo,
Mm-hmm.
we should probably be angry about the tens of thousands of women and children that the US government is keeping in limbo in these camps. And the weird thing is, and I am getting a lot more interested in this problem because I now see a solution. These guys are, a lot of them are still men and women very committed to the Islamic State, but like so was Jolani,
Mm-hmm.
so was Ahmed al-Shara. And the thing about this is that like the truly like hardcore, the truly nasty types, Ahmed al-Shara will probably just execute, which, isn't great. But I don't expect there will be
Is
many
it
of those.
possible they won't take a deal with him if they're so extreme? So they'll probably just stay in prison forever?
Honestly, I would assume that almost all of them would take a deal with him and would live in Syria. And it's like the cursed problem with Guantanamo is like who wants to take, those 10 people, not the
Mm-hmm.
people not the countries they came from, not, nobody wants to deal with it. And that is exactly what the case was with these tens of thousands of people being maintained in permanent question mark amorphous prisons in the Kurdish regions of Syria. It seems like HTS is willing to take those folks. And you know what? They'll probably just set them all free. But like the people who went to Syria to fight with the Islamic State, some of them are legitimately
Oh
evil, what
yeah,
have
yeah.
you. A lot of them just wanted to go fight against Assad, which was a cause that US and European media were selling. And like a lot of these people got railroaded into supporting the Islamic State. I think it's not clear to me to what extent the people in these camps are foreign or are Syrian. I assume they're the vast majority Syrian, but with big foreign chunks. Let the Syrian government handle that. I think that'd be a huge step forward to justice and sensibility. It would provide another
Bargaining chip.
bargaining chip and interesting lever through which Ahmed al-Shara can sort of prove that he's willing to work with Europe and the U.S. To be clear, I think it's outrageous that the United States is has maintained these sanctions.
Hmm.
But like, this looks like a solution here, and I think the Kurds desperately now want to hold on to these camps because they don't want this. They don't want this problem solved. But that is one really optimistic thing that, like, really one of the greatest injustices the United States has been committing over the past decade, something that I just didn't look at because I saw no
Yeah.
solution to it, could just
Until
be
now.
solved. Yeah, could just be like solved. I think that there's a lot of scope for refugees returning. There was a lot of very hopeful images of like, look at this line of cars coming down to the border from Lebanon or whatever, and that is functionally meaningless. It would take
But it's also
years
the
worth.
fact if you've spent so long, say you moved to America, that's 10 years ago, you've started a whole new life. It's like, oh, well, I throw my hat in with something that could collapse within a year.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of hopes that could become to fruition. Who knows? I mean, it's been a surprisingly good month for Syria since I think it was December 7th or 8th, where Assad fled the country. It's been a surprisingly good month. If
And it was
there's
surprisingly bloodless for Syrian standards.
Yeah, and if it's another 6 or 7 surprisingly bloodless months, that'd be great. To be clear, it has been a bloody, nasty month for the Kurds. That's probably going to continue. There was hopeful talk about agreements
Hmm.
between Turks and Syria, between Syria and the Kurds, between Turks and the Kurds. Da, da, da. But the news right before recording this is Hakan Fidan being like, "We're going to crush them," So, but that's been bloody. But much of the country's experience has been surprisingly positive, surprisingly bloodless. If that continues for 5 to 6 months, there's a real chance of large refugee repatriation. I think something that we could get like immediately, which neither the Kurds nor the U.S. military wants to do, because both the Kurds and the U.S. military want things to do and reasons to get money, is just dump these illegal, amorphous nightmare Guantanamo prisons for children. Just dump them on HTS because they seem happy to take them.
It sounds crude, but it's better than the current situation.
It sounds like that's a huge win that I think possibly we could get out of the next Trump administration. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be much real positive movement from the Trump administration because they're probably going to be excessively guided by Israel here, which has really, I think, it's too early to tell, but I suspect in the fullness of time, years and decades, I think we're going to realize that Israel really shot itself in the foot by trying to overthrow Assad. The Ahmed al-Shara is, for months and years to come, is going to desperately avoid saying anything against Israel. But this is a guy whose nom de guerre was al-Jolani, which is the Golan Heights, because his family came from the Golan Heights.
Wow.
And that was the name that he chose to fight for the Islamic State under. And I was just reading this morning, apparently his moment of radicalization, this guy's a couple years younger than I am, but his radicalization as a teenager was the Second Palestinian Intifada. So yeah, there are a lot of bad options here for Israel, and they are mostly worse than Assad was. And I think that, unfortunately, because Israel's choices are always stupid and aggressive, much like America's choices, 95% of the time, the Trump administration is probably just going to let them have their reign, and That strikes me. Perhaps there's a world in which that yields positive results for Syria, but it's a world that's hard for me to see, Rory.
Hmm. So you can't see America. It's kind of got what it's wanted. Turkey's happy, Israel's happy. Could you not see it being more optimistic and trying to make, Syria a happy, prosperous country?
That'd be nice, Rory. That'd be nice. But
Okay.
I think Israel's probably going to try to maintain those sanctions against Syria and just sort
Yeah.
of keep it as a depopulated no man's land. I think they're going to get a lot of resistance on that from Europe, to say the least, because I know there's a lot of European governments that are
Hmm.
eager for some degree of Syrian repatriation. So I don't know. We'll see.
Well, we'll catch you next time. We hope the best for Syria.
Yeah, I hope that was a helpful review. I feel like we didn't cover half of what I wanted to cover.
Oh,
but
definitely.
It's been
But
an hour.
that's Syria.
And I don't doubt that we'll have sad reasons to talk
Mhm.
more about Syria in the coming year. Or hopefully, we'll probably update in a couple months' time, regardless.
Hopefully Trump's just
Hopefully
really
to say
chill
nice
this time.
things. Yeah, everything will be great and relaxing.
Let's
Here's
hope
hoping.
he's a little bit more like Jimmy Carter.
I don't agree with that. But we'll find out.
Time will tell.
Jimmy Carter was a very nice post-president, but as a foreign policy president, he was not good, Rory, as we will discuss next time.
Ciao, ciao.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.